I want to welcome Rabbi Rosenblatt. Rabbi is making his debut on Torah in Motion. As you may have heard, he's on the West Coast in Vancouver, where he serves as the rabbi of the largest. I don't know if you're the only Orthodox shul in
We're
Vancouver.
not the only. We're not the only.
There, obviously, there's a Chabad, but the largest Orthodox shul in Vancouver the last 23 years. He is a graduate of Columbia University and of Yeshiva University. And it's really, we go east and west all over. So it's really a pleasure to welcome him to Torah in Motion. And Vakasha, Rabbi Rosenblatt, it's all yours.
Okay, fantastic. So, what I'm doing right now is I'm doing something which I would title or explain as an interdisciplinary idea. That I think there's something very unique that we can learn about the experience of the Marranos, which also can impact our own understanding of Torah, Seder, and perhaps even more deeply Jewish identity. So without beating around the bush anymore, let's move to our subject. So why this subject? So it has always impressed me the way that the Rambam explains the act of telling the story. And he tells us mitzvah lahodia levanim. We have a mitzvah to inform our children, afilu lo sha'alu, even if they didn't ask. Lefi da'ato shel ben aviv melamdo, according to the knowledge of the child, the father instructs. Ketzad, what does that mean? Im haya katan o tipesh, omer lo b'ni, kulanu hayinu avadim. He says to him, if his son is young, or I guess the word tipesh is he translated here as foolish, but perhaps we could say unschooled, unlettered, or blind to certain things in the world. And the father should say to him, look, my son, we were all slaves in Egypt, like this maidservant or this slave. I think that's very crucial, because what Rambam is essentially saying is you have to create a concrete understanding of what slavery in Egypt was like, and we pin it to a particular slave experience. Now, in the days of Maimonides, slave trade was an active thing, and you could find them at your local market, and the slave markets and Jews and redeeming captives and slaves continued for hundreds of years after the Rambam was alive. But for us, I thank God we live in Western societies, and we don't have that same perspective. But perhaps there are stories within our history, our collective memory, or even in contemporary scenarios where we can say, oh, you know what, there's something that will teach us about the experience of having been slaves in Egypt by looking at this slave, this experience, that oppression, etc. So here I want to take us to a very particular line in the Magid. In the Magid section, we are interpreting this section from the book of Devarim, what's known as Vidoi Bikurim, the confession of the first fruits, when you would have brought your first fruits to the temple and presented them to the Kohen. And this is the text that the Haggadah chooses to use as its basis for interpretation to really tell the story. And one of the aspects of that story is Vayihi Sham Lagoy, and they shall be a nation there. Melamed Shayu Yisrael Mitsuyanim Sham. And we learn here that Israel became a nation. From this, we learn that Israel became distinct in Egypt. There was some kind of method of distinction. There was some signature Jewish thing. You could smell a Jew, you could tell a Jew a mile away. I think today they call this bageling, right? How do you tell someone's a Jew without saying you're Jewish, right? Now, it's very often sort of the kind of thing that you learn in grade school, in early childhood classic Jewish education, is this lesson from the Pesach Zutra, which is a rabbinic compilation of midrashim. And here it tells us that what was distinct about them. So it says that they were distinct there in Egypt, their clothing, their food, and their language. So maybe they kept kosher, maybe there were certain kashrut laws, Jews dressed as Jews, and they, I guess, spoke Hebrew. These things kept them as a sort of distinct ethnic, cultural, even national group. So this is part of what the Egyptian experience is like. When you drill down, I think, a little bit further, you're going to discover that the very rituals that became Pesach uh, were were a number that created very distinct choices. You could either be Jewish or Egyptian, but you could not do both. The very first mitzvah that is given to the Jewish people is, of course, the calendar. And the creating a different calendar put Jews on a different scale. Just there are a lot of nuances to this, and I need to move through this quickly. But just to give you an interesting idea, in almost every culture, the months are named after gods. We are currently in March. March is, of course, named after the Roman Greek god of war, Mars. This was true in Egyptian society as well. And so in not the months that we use now. The months that we use now are not truly the Jewish months. Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, Tammuz, those are all Babylonian adoptions that we took on much later. They don't get used until Megillat Esther. The scroll of Esther, the experience of Mordechai, it's a diaspora phenomenon. If you read the Torah from the book of Exodus all the way through the book of Kings, you will find that the months are named 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way to 12, and they're the months counting the first month since we left Egypt, the second month since we left Egypt, third month. So it's a very interesting cultural phenomenon on the calendar, making us a different kind of people. Similarly, the Passover offering, we're very clear from the verses in the books of both Bereshit and Shemot that the Passover offering was an abomination to the Egyptians. Roasting this whole, and by the way, this is an AI-generated image of people roasting the lamb whole, rosho al kira'av al kirbo, so that there was no question of what you were roasting. Everybody knew it was being roasted there. It was an abomination to the Egyptians, and it was a bit of a act of protest. So the blood on the doorpost, which ultimately becomes the mezuzah, is an act of marking the Jewish home. And last but not least, food as identity is a very, very strong concept. Really, the most durable explanation of kashrut is identity. The very few explanations work through every context of kashrut, but of those, the single most glaring of them is the idea that Jews are going to have to eat a distinct food, and there's no Jewish food which is more identity than matzah. And the fact that we also at the same time have to reject chametz, which was perhaps connected to the hydraulic society of Egypt, the sort of the oppressive regime that creates this canal system that makes the Nile into a gold mine of agricultural production. The Egyptians invented beer fermentation. So chametz becomes signature Egyptian food, and we're going to show how we are fully distinct there. So everything about the exodus from Egypt is about these external, very identifiable kinds of cultural distinctions of mitsuyanim. Okay, now for the conversos, this is entirely inverted. Everything is in a completely different dimension, because the rituals of separation were a death sentence. Just to give you a very simple example, Rabbi Shlomo ibn Virga, who we'll talk about a number of times, Shlomo ibn Virga was a Portuguese Jew who writes a book called the Shevet Yehuda. The Shevet Yehuda is one of those books of Jewish history that is written in the very beginning of the modern era, and it is ultimately printed in the Ottoman Empire. He buries it under a tree. He smuggles it out of Portugal when he has opportunity to leave, and it is a record of the oppression of the Jews of Spain and Portugal. And one of the things he says is, he puts in the voice of the inquisitor, "Oh, how do you know which of the Jewish houses are? Well, you go up to the church spire, or you go up to some high point in the city, and you go look at whose chimneys are not producing a fire in the winter on the Sabbath. Those are the secret Jews." Okay, so you can see how every little thing was a death sentence. there are literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of practices which were signature Jewish, which would identify them. But certainly, mezuzah they could not have, and Brit Milah was another one. The whole discussion about, and we'll see a little bit more later on in this discussion, but Brit Milah, you could not circumcise yourself in that context. Just, I'm going to leave crumbs for further discussion, but there's a very interesting figure named Shlomo Malcho, who encounters someone who sort of sets him up as almost a messianic figure whose name is David Haruveni. And Shlomo Malcho is a magistrate. He's a judge on the appeals court of the Portuguese Court of Appeals, at a very young age. He's a brilliant person. And he encounters this real Jew, David Haruveni, and he realizes he's not circumcised. So he circumcises himself, almost kills himself in circumcision. And David Haruveni says, "What are you doing? You're going to get me killed too for convincing you to do circumcision. You can't keep this as a secret." And
Hey, go in first.
Sorry? Question? No. Okay. So the story of Shlomo Malcho is a very interesting one, but basically it proves the fact that you cannot do Brit Milah. So these kinds of things which would make people
Rebecca, the second is the best.
Okay, somebody, Shay, you took away my ability to share.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I wasn't co-host, so I couldn't mute the person. I'm sorry. So I had to do that. Now you can share. I apologize for that.
Okay, no worries.
You can share and I can mute if somebody talks. But please do keep your sound muted until the end.
Okay. All right. Okay. All good. I was about to do that on the participants myself. So, but all good. Okay. All right, so that's the story of Brit Milah. So you can understand, you cannot be, the Anusim could not be Mitsuyanim, they could not be distinct through these outward pieces. Also, when you get to practices which are clearly based in the Talmud, there was a very deep Christian polemic against the Talmud. About 100 years before we get the Anusim, there's the famous burning of the Talmud in Paris, and the Christians had a special hate for the Talmud because they saw the Jews as the stewards of the Old Testament, and they see the Talmud as replacing the Old Testament. And so Talmudic rituals brought a unique risk, which sort of brings us to this third point here, which is that Jewish practice often, for the Marranos, was often tied exclusively to the Bible. So you'll be surprised that for Purim, the conversos fasted for 3 days, because if you read the verse in Esther, Megillat Esther, right? Sumo alai shloshet yamim laila vayom. Fast for me 3 days, day and night. And amongst the practices that they did practice, also fasting was a particularly widely adopted one, because it's really hard to punish someone for fasting. Inaction is a lot more discreet than action. Okay, so we have to do a brief and selected history of the converso journey. And really, I think popular opinion thinks that the whole story starts in 1492. That's really only the midpoint of the story. The real story starts in 1391. On your right is Vincent Ferrer, Saint Vincent. He's not a saint in our books. He was a rabid anti-Semite and preached just absolute vitriol against the Jews. And so riots started to sweep across Spain in June in Seville, July in Valencia, August in Barcelona. And it's hard to know exact numbers, but somewhere between 50 and 100,000 Jews convert to save their lives in these events. And so you have this mass conversion of Jews because of popular riots that are really the product of just hateful preaching. And so one scholar said the church went from the problem of infidels outside the church, that's us Jews, to heretics within the church. And this is what brings us to the Inquisition, because actually these converts are much more dangerous to the church as Christians than they are as Jews. And it should also be understood the church had no jurisdiction over the Jews. The Inquisition does not punish Jews. The Inquisition only punishes Christians for Judaizing, for engaging in Jewish practice. And so this brings us to the following. We're going to have essentially three stages of different kinds of celebrations that Jews have for Pesach. So the first stage is between 1391, when those riots took place, and 1478, which is when the Inquisition comes to be. And these are often, you have to understand, the riots were a random thing. So people got caught up in a riot. Somebody else was away on a business trip. Somebody else was lying sick in bed and wasn't in trouble, right? So half the family was Jewish, half the family was newly Christian, right? So who'd you have at Seder last year? So you invite the same group of people this year. Just half of them happen to be Christian now. And so we have a lot of this, the information that we have of this comes from records of the Inquisition, of which there are many, and they are kept very carefully. But in one of these, we have a converso named Papudo from Burgos, which is in Castile, in the home of Yuda Rabenuka. I assume that's like, the kind of name like Yehuda Beirav, or it's a Jew. Yehuda Rab. I mean, it's such a classic Jewish name. Yehuda, which is Jewish, Rabbinika, right? Rabbi. But okay, I assume that's his real name. I'm not just a disclosure. I get all of my stuff from secondary sources. I understand a little bit of Spanish and no Portuguese, so I can't really tell you that I've combed through these sources. I get them all in the secondary literature. But he says, I was eating with him celery and bitter herbs. They ate on the first evening of that festival, and of the unleavened bread, along with everyone else who was at the Jew's house, and recited the prayers with him, which he knew by heart. Right. So in this generation, the conversos, they were Jewish. They know the rituals. They know the songs. They can sing Dayenu together. They're not missing any of the education. The second stage that we're dealing with is when the Inquisition comes in. So the Inquisition's introduction is when the church realized it has a problem. And the Inquisition comes in before the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. One of the great scholars of this is Cecil Roth. And Cecil Roth said Jews held their Seders after the first 2 nights of Pesach to throw off the inquisitional attention. So this is some of the first evidence we have that the date is not the same. But this is the generation that still remembers. They still have a good grasp. There's still Jews in the area for them to learn from and to glean things from, but they have to alter their practice because you can't be in the crosshairs of the Inquisition. And the Inquisition did the tortures that they had invented. They're not allowed to draw blood. So they had, this is not the time or place, but they're particularly cruel. They would put people on the wheel, and they did waterboarding, and they would bind their arms and hang them from their arms bound behind their backs, because they could mangle your limbs. They just couldn't draw blood. Interesting laws. And you here on the left, you see the seal of the Inquisition, which I think is particularly ironic, but it gives you a sense of what that world was like. You have the sword symbolizing the punishment of heretics, the olive branch, which is the reconciliation with the repentant, and of course the Latin inscription, which is of course from the Tehillim. But this gives you the most insight into where the church was. Arise, Lord, and champion your cause. Be mindful that you are blasphemed by scoundrels all day long. When Christians read that verse, they read that verse. This is referring to the Jews. The Jews, it's obvious to them that the Christian Savior is true and he's come to save the entire world, and you Jews are blind, and you're being absolutely ridiculous. It's like being flat earthers to them. And so that's how the Inquisition came. Now, there are all sorts of negative sides to this Inquisition, which is that if you found someone guilty in the Inquisition, his property would revert to the church. And so there was a little bit of incentive to go after some of these rich Jews. So this is stage 2. Stage 3 is after the Inquisition. After the Inquisition, the rituals are going to change quite significantly. There's not going to be contact after the expulsion. After the expulsion, you're going to get secret places of worship. So in March of 1500, for example, in Valencia, they discovered a clandestine synagogue in the home of merchant Miguel Vives, and a group was found there observing the Seder. I can't find you any structural evidence of the Jewish version of this, but there's a museum in Amsterdam called Our Lord in the Attic in Amsterdam, and this is like a little schematic which is generated by AI, and it's not fully accurate to the actual building, but it sort of gives you the idea that in the bottom two floors, life is normal. In the attic, there's a church, and this was kind of how Jews practiced. There's also some evidence that maybe the most famous of all the Marranos, which was Dona Gracia Mendes Nasi, also had, they were privileged enough to be able to have their own private service. And the rumor was that there were exactly 10 men there, and all they said were the Tehillim. They read only from the Psalms. Again, it's not fully substantiated, but it's very possible that there were many of these pockets. And obviously, they had to operate with great secrecy. So here is just a window into what some of these moments felt like. And here again, this comes from the official inquisitional record, and this is the Inquisition in 1502, but it's speaking about the spring of 1492. In July of 1492 is when the Jews are expelled. So this is giving you a very interesting timestamp, and you can understand what's going on. And this is specifically a reference to a particular moment of Pesach. So he said that year the magistrates ordered the Jews to leave Castile. He spent Passover with the Jews at the home of Isaac the Portuguese, teaching one of Isaac's sons to read the holy books. While they were reading, old Fernando de Guernica, the pot maker, he came in, who was a great friend of Isaac, and he came in and said, "What are you doing? Misfortune take you. You are wasting time. You read, and even this fellow, alas, he thinks he's doing something useful." He was referring to me. You would do better, festival or not, to spend your time thinking how you're going to liquidate your property and how are you going to depart. Some people say that you should become a Christian, but may God ruin my holiday if I advise it. The reason is that once you have become a Christian, they will figure out a way to shove your face in the fire. This reflects so many different emotions. It reflects the idea that there was great despair. What are you supposed to do? By the way, leaving was extremely dangerous. People knew that they had to leave. People knew that they weren't allowed to take their property. It was fire sale prices for the Jews. There was nothing to guarantee them. If you hired a ship's captain, Rabbi Shlomo Ibn Virga tells us stories of people being left on a deserted island and their children dying, their wife dying, pleading with Hashem to take their own lives so they don't have to take these miseries. Leaving was very difficult thing. Staying was difficult. Becoming Christian was difficult because, as he points out, they'll figure out a way to punish you even for that. So you see this moment where one person is saying, "I'm trying to continue even under all this oppression to learn how to keep Pesach, to study it, but I can't, right? Because," or someone even comes in and says, "You shouldn't do this. This is going to be dangerous for you. Figure out how to keep your money and get out of this place." One of the things which I think to me is very interesting about the story of the Anusim is the internalization of Mitsuyanim. And this might be the most important thing I think we have to learn from them, is they clearly could not be Mitsuyanim on the outside. They had to be Mitsuyanim in the inside. So a lot of this comes from the work of Simcha Asaf. Simcha Asaf was a TELS graduate who became a professor at the Hebrew University without ever having gone to university, and then became a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Israel. Does fantastic work on the history of rabbinic law. But he has a very important article on the Anusim and the halachic aspects of the Anusim. So he tells the story based on the records of the Canary Islands that when the Jew would go take the chalice for Mass, he would klap al chet. Can you imagine? Right? We as Jews, like the idea that we would, I think we feel a little bad, when we wish someone Merry Christmas, right? We just have you'll notice a lot of rabbis, they don't, they'll call Xmas, right? The moment you bring us anywhere near something that has the word mass, we go crazy, right? We have this sort of antibodies to it. Here, he's got to go in front of the priest, and I guess he gets the wafer, the wine. I don't know exactly. It's good I don't know how to take mass, but you only eat one of the other. I know that much I do know. And so then he's clapping achet as he's taking the wafer, right? It was an idea amongst the Anusim, recorded again by Rabbi Shlomo Ibn Virga and the Shevet Yehuda, that the prohibition of idol worship is only if you believe in your heart at the time of worship, right? So this is attributed to a letter to the biblical figure Baruch ben Neriah. But again, if you go into church, it's okay as long as you don't believe it. And there's a widely described phenomenon that when Anusim went into church, they whispered Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, right? God is one, because in the church, God is not one. This, by the way, is an actual image of the records of the Inquisition of the Canary Islands. Okay. So how did they keep community? How did they find each other? How were they mitsuyanim without getting noticed? So there was several practices. One, they would apprentice their children to a Jewish master artisan. They had business networks. They also practiced endogamy, which means and we'll see how this translates halachically a little bit later on in our discussion. But here, one of the most famous of the Anusim, Dana Gracia Mendes Nasi, she marries her uncle, and her sister also marries the uncle's brother, so also her uncle. And so that's a very important example of endogamy. Secure procedures for indoctrinating children, and women played the strongest role. So there were, I guess, special rules for how you taught this to your children. They were only taught around the age of 8 or 9. They wouldn't be invited any sooner than that. Okay. There are certain known ways of remembering Jewish practice after the expulsion. So first of all, in Portugal, it was very interesting. The conversion of the Jews in Portugal were because the king of Portugal wanted to marry the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, and they could not countenance such a marriage to a country that had so much Jewish tuma, so much Jewish impurity in it. So he agreed to forcibly convert his Jews, and they forcibly converted their Jews in a very, very underhanded way. They essentially brought all the kids to public square. They sprinkled them with holy water. They said, the kids are now converted, and they took them off to the monastery. They said, you want to get your kids back? You've got to convert. But there were certain leniencies. There was an understanding that wasn't really super serious, and they allowed them, they promised there was going to be no inquisition, and they even allowed them to keep their Jewish books for about 25 years. So the Portuguese Jews actually had at least they had some access to their former methods of instruction. There was oral tradition was very, very important. And you can imagine if all of your Sidurim were taken away, all of your Chumashim were taken away, there's certain things you would still remember. You can still recite the Shema, you might know how to say the Amidah, the things we say the most, you might know how to do Kiddush on Friday night, but Yom Kippur Katan, you probably would forget. Maybe Karbanot that, you have a little trouble with. I don't know, Hineni, some of the Rosh Hashanah prayers would be harder for us to reproduce because they're not things that we say all the time. But again, coming back to something, they were very, very close to the Bible. They understood that the Hebrew, what we call the Hebrew Bible, was always printed in the Christian Bibles, and they read it in the Vulgate, in the Latin. And then there's something very interesting, something called the Edicts of Grace. Now, the Edicts of Grace, and this is an actual image of the Edicts of Grace in 1524, the Edicts of Grace were instructions that the church put out that said, this is how you can recognize a Jew. These are the practices that you're going to see recognizing the Jews. So the Jews could take the Edict of Grace and say, oh, Taka, this is how we practice various things. There's sort of a strange irony there on that whole subject. Okay. This is a picture, by the way, of Simcha Asaf. And he reads, he tells us a little bit about, what it meant for Anusim to preserve their Jewish character. Chashad kal shebekalim, the smallest, littlest suspicion, Shmirat mitzvot, of the observance of mitzvot, or minhag Yehudi, even a Jewish practice. For example, by the way, Jews did not sweep dirt out of the house past the mezuzah. They only swept into the house because they didn't want to put dirt past the mezuzah. It's a very strange Jewish practice. But that's like an example. They could come to the worst outcomes, right? Worst punishments of the Inquisition, being burned alive. Regardless of all the danger that surrounded this, we still have evidence that these people wanted nothing more than to pass Judaism on to their children. And again, this comes from the writings of the Shevet Yehuda, Rabbi Shlomo ibn Verga. And he writes that of an account of an advisor telling one of the Christian kings, Teda Adonenu, no, my king, the Jews are better Jews. They keep more of the mitzvot now after the oppression than they used to beforehand. So, just to sort of show the delicate balance of the way things worked, the Anusim for generations, and we'll see this when we get to a little discussion about Amsterdam, for generations, literally hundreds of years, have a fervent desire to escape their circumstances and to go to organized Jewish communities or be able to live freely as Jews. So when they return to places where they're allowed to do so, and two examples of these are the Italian cities of Pisa and Livorno. So what happens if a guy comes back and he's afraid to get circumcised? Whether it's the trauma of what happened to people he knew who were circumcised, or whether it's because he has to go back and forth for business and he doesn't want to demonstrate that he's now a Jew. So the rabbis of Pisa said, okay, you can still wear tefillin, you can open the ark, you can hold the Torah, even if you are an arel, even if you're uncircumcised. But the rabbis of Livorno would have nothing of it, right? They would say the hour no longer demands the behavior. They could understand, right? When you were in Spain, Portugal, then we understand. But now there is no such restriction placed upon you. You're living in Livorno. Livorno is a free city. There's no Inquisition here, and you can be Yisraelim Gemurim. You can be completely Jewish, and you should be circumcised. And if you're not, we're not going to give you the privilege of wearing tefillin, and we're not going to give you the privilege of holding the Torah. There's advice, by the way, that is given to the Jews keeping Pesach in Spain. And this was given by Rabbi Shlomo Doran, the Av Beit Din in Algiers. And what he said, one of the things he says is that you can eat matzah all year round. So if you eat matzah all year round, you say, oh, this is just the bread I like. This is, by the way, probably proof that their matzah was not hard. It's probably like, laffa bread, right? It was flat cakes. So, that's the kind of bread we eat, right? Like imagine somebody who only eats, pitas, lafas all year round, not the pitas that we have, but just sort of flat breads, tortilla-like things. So if you make tortillas all year round, so okay, you're making matzahs all year round. Another one is if you make matzah with milk, it becomes matzah ashira, and that maybe that will throw off the Inquisition. And matzah ashira, you could say this isn't real matzah. Matzah is only made with water. But there's a position in halacha that b'diavad matzah ashira might be kosher for matzah. And he has another interesting idea about scalding the flour with boiling water. Even though the Gaonim said that this was not kosher for our matzah, even so, he says that this would be kosher enough under your circumstances. And then he He tells people to make matzah a month earlier, grind them together, make bread. He has all these suggestions. But what you're seeing here is evidence of communication between Algiers, right, just across the Mediterranean from Spain. And you're seeing that there's a communication and there is this intense desire to keep Pesach. One of the things which was very very unique is that our calendar is so different that we need special calculations to get to that, right? So how do you know when Pesach is? You get your Jewish calendar. Most Jews are not good at calculating the very complicated math of the Jewish calendar. When is there supposed to be a leap year? When are certain months malay, full, chaser? All these things are very difficult. And so the Anusim, when they were detached from that, they had to come up with the date of Pesach. So there's evidence from Mexico that it was the 1st of April. There's others who say, no, it has to be in the month of March. This is from the Granada Inquisition. The Portuguese New Christian, they had Santa Festa on the 14th day of the new moon of March. This is actually relatively accurate, right? It works for this year, right? So the new moon of March was I guess today's the 7th of Nisan. It was a week ago. The new moon of March was a week ago. So you go 2 weeks from then. Well, April 1st, that's when you're going to have Pesach. It doesn't work on certain leap years, right? Like next year, it's not going to work because Pesach is going to be in end of April. So then it won't be 14 days after the new moon of March. But for probably, 14 out of the 19 years of the Jewish calendar cycle, that's going to work. Some places kept it on Holy Thursday, which is interesting because now they're pegging to the Christian calendar. But this is exactly that kind of idea of internally mitzuyanim. Yes, we're keeping the Christian calendar. We're keeping Pesach on Easter, but we're keeping it Jewish style. And then, as described earlier, Cecil Roth said there were certain Anusim who said, okay, look, we can't do the mitzvah on the day, but we need to preserve it. So we're going to do Pesach on Chol HaMoed, and then no one can accuse us because we'll say, well, that wasn't the right date. Again, this is JTS manuscript of Inquisition records, and it says, in the spring on a certain day, she does not remember, but last year it was Holy Thursday. She was to observe a fast called the Feast of the Lamb. Now you'll notice that fast has got to be the Ta'anit B'chorot, right? It's got to be the fast of the firstborn. But the Anusim are remembering this connected to the Lamb because they're probably anchoring to the Bible. But they know that their grandmothers fasted on these days, and these fasts became very important. They were the most observed rituals. They did not eat or drink the entire day. And after this fast, she should celebrate Passover. And the Passover was kept 7 days, and she should slaughter a lamb which was to be roasted whole, right? And so they don't know that we're not doing the ceremony of the lamb anymore. They don't have a Torah Baal Peh to tell them not to do that. They're pegged to the Bible. And to invite all our relatives to a feast, and the bones were to be burned, which commemorated the sacrifice of the law of Moses. Who knows where that came from? Was that from burning the chametz? Was that from an idea from the Bible that was there are certain things that were burnt on the mizbeach? And on those 7 days, she had to eat unleavened bread, nor could she have any leaven in the house. And that which was to prepare little flat cakes on a new brick and cook them on the fire. And these were to be distributed among her relatives. So again, you see these little pieces. There's some pieces we recognize about Pesach. There's some pieces we recognize from the Torah. And then she's obviously doing kashrus by getting a new brick to put on her stove, and she distributes them amongst her relatives. Sometimes we think about only Spain and Portugal. This comes from a Mexican auto de fe, which obviously in Mexico, one of the things the Spanish brought to their colony was the Inquisition. And we're told that a certain person punished by the Inquisition, his grandmother told him to remain reclining and to keep his head covered and not to eat any other bread during those days. So he has it, we're talking about 1649, right? So you're talking about almost 300 years since the 1391 riots. This is remarkable, right? We here in the West, we have trouble keeping 2 generations to practice their Judaism. Here, you're talking about hundreds of years that they managed to keep these rituals alive without organized schooling, without being able to have an organized community, all done in secret. This is, to me, one of the most interesting things. They didn't have Haggadah. You couldn't have printed Jewish books, especially as you went forward. So what did people do? They took different things that they could more or less out of the Bible. They could recite the Song of Moses, Az Yashir. They reenacted the story as they could. And one of the most common practices was to read from the Latin Bible, the Vulgate Bible, which you have pictured here on the right, from the Bodleian Library's collection. This is my favorite of all the rituals, and you'll forgive the AI rendition, but I just needed to. I was so excited by this visual, I just decided I needed to be able to look at it. Diego Moro of Quintara de la Orden in 1589, he's accused of writing the Seder, boots in hand, he's wearing boots and a staff in his hand and standing, right? And this is exactly what we're told, right? This is how you shall eat the Passover offering. You're girded with your belt, your shoes on your feet, your staff in your hand. You shall eat it swiftly. Pesach hu Hashem. It is a Passover to Hashem. So they really embodied the story as it was presented in the Bible. And so we have other evidence that the reader wore a white garment over his clothes with a belt tightened over his waist. So this is sort of there's just a little remnant of the kittel there, right? And he would read it out loud with the staff in his left hand and the Bible in his other hand. In the Mexican Inquisition, this again is a AI developed image, that Jews were apparently painted their doorposts in blood. I'm assuming it's the inside of the doorpost, and I guess it maybe wasn't super uncommon to use blood to paint your house red, but that's what they would do, right? They, again, observing this sort of biblical reenactment. The one thing I want us to also understand is the irrepressible hope of the Anusim. So one of the best places to see this is in Amsterdam. If you haven't been to Amsterdam and you have the opportunity to travel there, this is just an absolutely remarkable place to be. I mean, it's gorgeous. It's one of the most beautiful synagogues you will ever be in your entire life. It's lit by 2,000 candles, and unfortunately these days it's essentially empty, mostly because the center of Amsterdam is very expensive, and the Nazis also liquidated and killed and murdered, deported so many of the Jews in Amsterdam. But this is a monument of resilience, because this is built by the Portuguese Jewish community. The Portuguese Jewish community, essentially at the beginning of the 17th century, arrives in Amsterdam and they begin to flourish. They are brilliant traders. They're extremely wealthy, and they build this absolutely beautiful synagogue. It's actually patterned after the Beit HaMikdash. It's got a whole courtyard around it. But these are people who don't know anything, but they understand that they need to actually connect to a more organized Jewish community, and they have to embrace halacha. So they bring in a rabbi from the community of Anusim in Venice, which has already been much more normalized, and they're true standard bearers of halacha. But what is interesting is this is a photo from the floor of the Ma'amad. The Ma'amad is the council of the Jews in Amsterdam, and their symbol is the phoenix, right? Because they see themselves as a community reborn. But to me, this is the most amazing story, right? This is V'hisha Amda Lavoteinu V'lanu Shelo Echad Bilvad Amad Aleinu L'Chalotenu, right? Not just one stood against us; many stood against us, and this is the story of the church standing against us. V'Hakadosh Baruch Hu Matzilenu Mi'adam, and God saved us. The return of this community, the survival of this community, is absolutely remarkable. It's hard to think of another story like it in the story of the Jewish people. And the idea that, I think we have very little idea of how hard it was for the Jews to survive 210 years in Egypt. The closest thing we have, and the thing about which we're going to have the most memory and the most documentation, is in fact this intense oppression that the church had, and the revival of this community of conversos. This is just very quickly a sort of a family tree, so you just kind of understand the complicated web of how things work. So this is the story of Fernão Alvarez Melo, and we have some religious poetry of his when he comes back to Amsterdam. But you can see that his father is arrested by the Inquisition. His aunt dies in an auto da fe in Evora. His uncle is arrested in 1581, and his mother dies as a professing Jew in Tzfat. Tzfat is a city that was all of the Jews of Tzfat are somehow connected to the Anusim. The Arizal, Rav Yosef Karo, the Mabit, all of these, Shlomo Alkabetz, all of these Jews have origins in Spain and Portugal, and the story of Tzfat, the revival of the Sanhedrin, is deeply, deeply connected to this story of the Anusim. One of the aspects of that story of the revival of the Sanhedrin in Tzfat is that Yosef ibn Habib was against this because he was embarrassed about the fact that he may have had a history as a secret Jew, and all of these things revolving around his proper repentance, and to be able to have official lashes meted out by an ordained Beit Din. All of that, it just shows you how these families are very, very interconnected. Some living in very Jewish places like Tzfat, and others living in places where they are suffering the consequences of their secret Judaism. And even in the places where they're open and professing Jews, the story of survival continues to haunt them spiritually and psychologically. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but this is a poem by the same individual that, again, is part of this Amsterdam community. And he talks about his desire to be Jewish. You came to search for me, for I was fleeing from you, knowing I owed you a debt I cannot pay. Many times you have called me with overwhelming indulgence, at times by drawing blood from my soul, which now I feel, all because I did not follow that which my ancestors gave me. So you can see that there's this sort of longing for God, and etc. We can see that the Jews were ever hopeful of revival and return. So there's an interesting article that I came across called Passover in Mallorca by Professor Jonathan Schorsch of Potsdam University. And he goes to Mallorca and around Pesach, and he goes to the museum and he finds a Seder plate in a monastery in Mallorca that was brought in the 17th century from Italy. So the people are still smuggling in, dangerous things. And it was discovered when they celebrated Yom Kippur, and they were discovered there. The church took it. Now it's in a museum over there. To show you, by the way, how this community preserved itself. So this is from the Chuvot of Rabbi Shimon Duran. He's the grandson of the Tashbetz, this important Algerian rabbi. Actually, what does he say? He says, Cheskat kol hanusim ein nosin goyot. All of these conversos, they don't marry non-Jews. And this is a well-known thing. And we know that generation after generation, they don't do this. From the time of the Gzeira Ad Hayom, and I think my dates are wrong on this, but no, my dates are right, or Shimon Daran. But also, by the way, you should the further point he makes is any one of these Portuguese Jews or Spanish Jews, secret Jews, the conversos who come to do teshuvah, we machzikim oto she'aviv misrael, just as we assumed his father was Jewish. Kach machzikim oto she'imo misrael. We also assume as a chazaka, as a halachic status quo ante, that his mother is fully Jewish. Ve'ena goya, and she's not a non-Jew. Lo chashush la tzricham tefila b'chaziratam el yadut. We don't force them to go back to the mikvah when they come back, right? Because we assume that his mother is Jewish. Fascinating, right? Today, by the way, I'm not sure the rabbinical courts would be so lenient, but you can see that they had big shoulders back then. I think it should say she'etzlam. I think I have a typo there. That for them, someone who for these converso communities, these secret communities, someone who married a non-Jew was muruchak, was distant, umetuav, disgusting. They would no longer mix with that family. They said, oh, they're goyim, right? They had tremendous disdain. So this is Rabbi Shlomo Doran, who's the grandson, son of Rabbi Shimon Doran. It's one generation later, in his Chuvot Yachinu Boaz. And Rabbi Yom Tov Tzahalon in Tzfat, 1618, says it was discovered among the conversos that a family married a non-Jew. This would become well known among them, and they would be very careful. And the Hebrew is lihibadel, to separate from such a family. So you see that just sort of interesting. Even as they're all trying to survive, to dodge the Inquisition, they would stop marrying into people who gave in and married off to someone who was clearly Christian. So I just want to end by showing you just some of these things. A lot of this comes from the sources and the records of the Inquisition. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of this comes from secondary sources. There's an interesting book, Secrecy and Deceit. That's the religion of the crypto Jews. Simcha Asaf, who writes a Anusei Svarado Portugal, the forbidden Jews or the conversos of Spain and Portugal, and there's also Cecil Roth, the religion of the Marranos. That's Cecil Roth on the right. He's really maybe in certain ways maybe one of the original academics who really brings the story forth. Passover Mallorca, as I mentioned, Jonathan Shores and Jonathan Israel, diasporas within a diaspora, Jews, crypto Jews in the world of maritime empires. And there's enormous amounts of literature on the subject, a very interesting and well-researched subject. But I guess I should just close with the conclusions of identity. One of the things that we discover in the story of our Seder is that we were mitsuyanim sham, that we had to be distinct. The survival depends on being a distinct community, being a group of people who are ourselves part of a Jewish community that can be identified, that we have that sense of who we are. The Anusim had a particular challenge. They could not do that with the external. They're not wearing Magen David Adoms, they're not wearing a chamsa, they're not wearing a kippah, they're not wearing long skirts. There's nothing that they can do to identify themselves in this way. And so they have to do all of this internally, and they have a intense desire to preserve their Judaism. One of the things which is so inspiring about them is their desire, their hope, their longevity to be able to 250 years later come back and rebuild Amsterdam. And Amsterdam's not the only community. There's communities in all over the Ottoman Empire, Ancona, Venice, so many different places. And of course, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia are also communities that become large Jewish communities as part of the Spanish diaspora. This is a subject that has just a wellspring. But I guess I should stop waxing lyrical. I think that it's an important story for us to understand that this is part of our history and this is part of our survival. And it should remind us of how much to preserve. Actually, maybe I have one other interesting little thing, which is hold on. Yeah. Jonathan Schorsch talks about how in Mallorca they put on this concert of Ladino's music, and there are people there who are crying because they haven't heard that since the days of their grandmothers. So you're talking about people who were conversos, who are remembering songs. So you have this longevity of song, and if you need a little bit more inspiration to remember to sing at your Seder, maybe that's it. So with that, maybe I'll turn it over to questions. Let me look at the chat and see what I can. Is there?
I'd like to say one thing to you.
Yes.
You mispronounce the name of Cecil Roth. In English, the name is not Cecil, but Cecil.
Okay.
He was
Thank you.
Cecil Roth.
Okay, yafeh.
Do you have any numbers on how many have come back to Judaism?
I do not have that. Numbers in this are sometimes difficult to actually come by accurately. There are in some of the literature, there are some people sort of like look through the auto de fe and they say on the records of the Inquisition and they say, what percentage of women, and I have somewhere in my notes, didn't include it in this because I didn't want to overwhelm people with too much information, but there is an interesting discussion about which rituals were most kept and percentages of men versus women keeping different things. That is available. I don't have it at my fingertips.
All right. Any other questions, comments? Bakasha? Okay. Rabbi, thank you. It's still nice and early in the morning.
That's right.
On Kriyat Shema in Vancouver still. So
yeah. Well,
the 9 o'clock minyan.
We have our own version of being anusim because they just got rid of daylight savings time in British Columbia.
Yes, that's going to be really bad next winter. Where literally, if this class is given 8 months from now, where are we now? We're in March. And if this gets 8 months from now, it will still be dark in Vancouver, and because if they go to daylight saving time all year round, which I pray they don't do in Toronto, Ontario,
we don't shovel
they'll
snow.
do it if New York does it.
We don't shovel snow.
Yeah, I think that would be terrible, daylight savings all year round. It's better standard time, but I don't want standard time all year round either. Once in the summer, they give sunrise at 4:30, but anyways, okay. I don't know, 1 hour, one time a year. And anybody who travels can't complain that they can't switch their clock for an hour twice a year. All right. But thank you, Rabbi. Hope you enjoyed. Okay, at 1 o'clock. At 1 o'clock, Sarah Gordon was speaking. It's always wonderful. She'll be speaking, I think, on Storm and Egypt, and then at 8:30 tonight, Rabbi Helfgott, Natty Helfgott, who normally speaks on Yecheskel, will be giving a shir tonight, not on Sefer Yecheskel, but he will be giving on Kriyat Yamsuf. And then tomorrow, Shuli Mishkin, is her Thursday time slot, she'll be speaking. But it will be 11 a.m. I know normally when she gives her sort of series, she does it at 12 noon. But in keeping with every day, have shirim at 11 and 1. So she'll be speaking at 11 a.m. in the morning. And I forget now, I should have it in front of me. Tell me who's speaking at 1 p.m. tomorrow. And then we do have our Parsha Shir tomorrow night. Whatever, we have two more. I know. Avi Herzog, Rabbi Avi Herzog is making his debut on Torah Motion. That will be tomorrow. Avi made Aliyah recently, a few years ago. And then Friday, of course, I'll give my shir at 9:35. That'll be up.
Rav
But
Jay, there's a hand raised. I don't know if it's for you or for me.
we'll find out in 1 second. We'll find out in
Okay.
1 second. And then, of course, next week also, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. Tuesday, I'll give Divrei Torah for the Seder at 9:30 on Tuesday morning. But we'll have on Sunday, Monday, because 2 more shirim, 11 and 1. And okay. And we look forward to learning with you. And please invite a friend. And Rachel, what do you want to ask? Rachel, you can speak up now.
Yes, sorry, I had to unmute myself. Thank you so much for the shiur. I wanted to just make sure I want to be able to attend some of these Passover shiurim that you have, and I don't know if I just use the same login as this or.
Are you talking here to meet the Torah Motion? Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. So yeah. You register once and you get the login. It's the same login. Yeah. We're making the way we're doing these classes every day. It's the same login every day.
Wonderful.
You should get a reminder every day about it, every day with all the classes. But even if you don't get a reminder, show up at 11 and 1. And that's
11 and 1 every day. Okay, I
yeah,
can put it in my
yeah.
calendar until
8:30 tonight, Friday morning 9:35. But okay. But
all
so
right.
yes.
8:30 tonight, Friday morning, 9:35. Okay, and that's kind of early for me. I'm all the way in the
Yeah,
west.
you're also in the Eastern time zone and the Western time zone. Okay, what can you do? Yeah.
And then no, it's okay. I mean, it's great. I am up that early, but okay.
Yeah.
Anyhow, Pesach online classes. I'm here at the Torah in Motion. Is that where I find the?
Yeah, go to the Torah Motion website. Yeah, you should get it, the register email. If you're on our email list, which I assume you are, you should get it. But if you go to the Torah Motion website, on the programs, you can register. Everything is recorded. We get asked that all the time with the recording. I don't know. I'm not sure if we have yesterday's recordings up yet. That I don't know. But you can go to either the program page where you'll see the recordings on the bottom, or go to our YouTube channel and you listen to our 4,000 recordings of shiurim. So to keep you busy for a few years. Okay, everybody. Back at 1 p.m. Eastern. Rabbi, thank you. Have a wonderful day. Chag Sameach. Your good news, and hope your daughter gets home soon. Is she like in her gap year?
No, she's at Reichman University.
Oh, very nice. Okay, so she made Aliyah?
Yes.
Okay, very nice. Okay, enjoy.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, be well, everybody. Bye-bye.